August 15, 1945, 1400 hours, prisoner of war camp, Guam. Private First Class Hiroshi Yamamoto stood in the processing line at the American POW compound, watching something through the tropical heat that made no sense according to everything he understood about warfare, surrender, and what conquerors did to conquered enemies. American soldiers, the same soldiers who had killed thousands of his comrades during 3 years of brutal Pacific combat, were handing surrendered Japanese prisoners cups of cold water, packages of cigarettes, and what appeared to be wrapped sandwiches containing more food than Yamamoto had eaten in the previous week. Medical corpsmen were treating Japanese wounds with the same careful attention they gave American casualties. Military police were explaining camp rules through interpreters in calm voices that suggested concern for prisoner welfare rather than contempt for defeated enemies. Yamamoto had surrendered 3 days earlier on August 12th after his unit's position on northern Guam became untenable. He had expected immediate execution. This was what Japanese military training had taught about American treatment of prisoners. When Americans captured you, training said, they would torture you for information, mutilate your body, and kill you slowly to dishonor you and your family. Death in battle was preferable to capture. Surrender was unthinkable disgrace that justified suicide rather than enduring enemy cruelty. But the Americans hadn't executed him. They'd given him water when he was dehydrated. They'd treated his infected leg wound with sulfur drugs and clean bandages. They'd fed him hot food, real meat, vegetables, bread, portions that exceeded what Japanese army had provided even before supply lines collapsed. They'd processed him through a bureaucratic system that seemed more concerned with recording his name and unit correctly than with punishing him for fighting against them. Now, standing in the processing line watching Americans treat Japanese prisoners with efficiency and apparent disinterest rather than hatred, Yamamoto confronted cognitive dissonance that would reshape his understanding of warfare, national character, and everything he'd been taught about American barbarity versus Japanese civilization. Think about that moment, August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender hours earlier via radio broadcast. 3 years and 8 months of brutal Pacific combat characterized by mutual atrocities, racial hatred, and refusal to take prisoners on either side, had officially ended, and Japanese soldiers who expected torture were being given medical treatment, adequate food, and explanation of their rights under Geneva Convention that most had never heard of. What Yamamoto didn't know as he moved through the processing line was that American treatment of Japanese POWs, particularly after August 15th, would be characterized by deliberate effort to demonstrate American values through actions rather than words. That occupation authorities recognized that how Americans treated defeated enemies would shape post-war Japan more than any propaganda campaign could. That Japanese prisoners would become witnesses to American character in ways that would influence Japan's post-war relationship with America more than diplomatic agreements or imposed constitutions. What Yamamoto didn't know was that within weeks he would be eating ice cream, frozen dessert he'd never tasted before, served in American mess hall where Japanese prisoners ate the same food as American guards, that he would be given baseball equipment and encouraged to form teams that played against each other while American soldiers watched and cheered, that he would receive letters from Japanese American soldiers who had fought for America explaining why they'd chosen to fight for country that had imprisoned their families while maintaining loyalty to Japanese cultural heritage. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American psychological warfare officers had specifically designed POW treatment protocols to maximize demonstration of American affluence, democratic values, and humane conduct. That every meal, every medical treatment, every instance of respectful behavior was calculated to create cognitive dissonance between what Japanese soldiers had been taught about American barbarity and what they were experiencing as American prisoners. That this cognitive dissonance was intentional strategy to undermine Japanese militarism by proving through direct experience that everything Japanese military had taught about Americans was propaganda contradicted by reality. What Yamamoto didn't know was that 40 years later, in 1985, he would return to Guam as tourist, visiting the island where he'd surrendered. That he would meet former American soldier who had guarded him in 1945 and thank him for treatment that had transformed his understanding of former enemies. That he would tell American veteran, "Your kindness to defeated enemies taught me more about American character than any propaganda could have. You didn't just win war militarily, you won it morally by showing us you were better people than we'd been taught to believe." What Yamamoto didn't know was that Japanese POW experience in American custody would become foundation for post-war Japanese-American alliance that transformed bitter enemies into close allies within decades. That former prisoners who experienced American treatment firsthand would return to Japan as witnesses to American character who could testify from personal experience that Americans weren't barbarians but civilized people who treated defeated enemies with unexpected humanity. That this testimony would prove more persuasive than any government propaganda in convincing Japanese population to embrace American occupation and democratic reforms. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American treatment of Japanese POWs contrasted dramatically with Japanese treatment of American POWs, creating moral disparity that would shape post-war narratives and Japanese national self-reflection about militarism's costs. That American POWs in Japanese custody had experienced starvation, torture, medical neglect, and systematic abuse, resulting in 27% mortality rate compared to less than 4% mortality rate for Japanese POWs in American custody. That this contrast would force post-war Japan to confront uncomfortable truths about how their military had behaved versus how Americans had behaved. What Yamamoto didn't know was that among American guards at the POW camp were Japanese-American soldiers from 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in American military history, who had fought for America while their families were imprisoned in internment camps. That these soldiers would explain to Japanese prisoners how they reconciled fighting for country that discriminated against them while maintaining pride in Japanese heritage. That this complexity would demonstrate to Japanese prisoners that American democracy, despite its flaws, allowed for loyalty and criticism simultaneously in ways Japanese militarism never had. What Yamamoto didn't know was that the ice cream he would soon taste, frozen dessert served casually in POW camp mess hall, would become symbol in his memory of American abundance and casual generosity that seemed impossible to reconcile with Japanese propaganda about American moral bankruptcy. That 40 years later, he would tell his grandchildren about the ice cream as a moment when he realized everything he'd been taught about Americans was wrong and that defeat might ultimately prove beneficial if it meant learning from enemies who possessed strengths Japan needed to adopt. The mathematics of occupation were being written in ice cream servings and baseball games and medical treatments and respectful interactions between victors and vanquished. And those mathematics were proving something that would reshape post-war Asia, that how conquerors treated defeated enemies determined whether defeat produced lasting resentment or foundation for future alliance. That America's choice to treat Japanese POWs humanely despite 3 years of brutal combat was a strategic decision that would pay dividends far exceeding any punishment or vengeance could have achieved. By the time Yamamoto reached the front of the processing line at 14:30 hours, an American sergeant asked through interpreter if he had any medical concerns requiring immediate attention, asked with tone suggesting genuine concern rather than interrogation. Yamamoto's understanding of warfare, national character, and his own future was already transforming. The cognitive dissonance between expected torture and experienced kindness had begun a process that would continue for months, as accumulated evidence of American behavior contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had taught him to expect. August 10th, 1945. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Japanese military leadership faced decision about how to communicate surrender to forces still fighting across Pacific and Asia. Forces that had been taught surrender was ultimate disgrace, justifying suicide rather than dishonor. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi's final message to kamikaze pilots, dated August 10, 1945, preserved in archives and translated post-war, revealed leadership's struggle to reconcile propaganda they'd taught soldiers with reality of surrender they now faced. The message stated, according to translation, "Emperor has decided to end war through negotiation with America. This decision does not reflect failure of your courage or dedication. You have fought magnificently for 3 years against overwhelming material superiority, but circumstances require accepting conditions that will preserve Japan, even though they require surrender. You must accept Emperor's decision with same discipline you showed in combat." The message continued, according to translation, "You have been taught that surrender is disgrace and that death is preferable to capture. These teachings served purpose during combat, but circumstances have changed. Emperor's decision requires that you survive to rebuild Japan. You must not commit suicide. You must accept captivity if circumstances require it. Your duty now is surviving to serve Japan's reconstruction rather than dying to avoid capture." Most significantly, the message acknowledged, according to translation, "You have been taught that Americans will torture captured soldiers. This teaching was necessary to ensure you fought with maximum determination. But we now have evidence that American treatment of prisoners follows international standards. Captured soldiers are not tortured. They are provided adequate food and medical care. You need not fear capture as you were taught to fear it. Your duty is surviving war's end, regardless of whether you are captured or returned to Japan freely." This message, according to historical analysis, represented leadership's attempt to undo years of propaganda that had taught soldiers to fear capture more than death. But changing beliefs reinforced through years of military training required more than single message. It required experience contradicting propaganda, experience that POWs in American custody would gain through direct observation of American behavior. August 15th, 1945. 1200 hours. Hiroshi Yamamoto's post-war testimony, recorded in 1953 interview preserved in Japanese veterans' archives, described hearing Emperor's surrender broadcast while still in Japanese custody before transfer to American POW facility. According to the testimony, Yamamoto and surviving members of his unit were gathered in temporary holding area on northern Guam when Japanese officers assembled them at noon on August 15th. The testimony stated, "We were told Emperor would address nation via radio. This was unprecedented. Emperor had never spoken directly to people via broadcast. We knew something extraordinary was occurring. Officers set up radio and we listened to broadcast together." The testimony described reaction to Emperor's announcement according to archives. Yamamoto stated, "Emperor's voice was difficult to understand. He spoke in formal court Japanese unfamiliar to common soldiers, but his meaning was clear. War was ending. Japan was surrendering. We were to lay down arms and cease resistance. Many soldiers wept. Some spoke of committing suicide to avoid dishonor of surrender. Officers reminded us that Emperor's command required we survive. We were no longer permitted to choose death. Emperor had ordered us to live." The testimony documented that within hours, American forces began gathering Japanese soldiers who had been hiding in jungle for transfer to POW facilities. According to the account, "We expected execution. We had been taught Americans showed no mercy to prisoners. We believed we would be tortured and killed. When American soldiers arrived, they were armed, but not aggressive. They gestured for us to follow them. They offered water and cigarettes. This behavior contradicted everything we expected. Some soldiers remained suspicious, believing Americans were deceiving us before torture began. But no torture came, only water and cigarettes and polite gestures to follow them to processing area. August 16, 1945. Yamamoto's testimony described arriving at American POW processing facility and experiencing treatment that systematically contradicted Japanese propaganda about American barbarity. According to the testimony, processing began with medical examination. The testimony stated American medics examined each prisoner, checking for wounds and illness. When they discovered my infected leg wound, they immediately cleaned it, applied sulfur powder, and bandaged it properly. They gave me pain medication and told interpreter I should report to medical tent daily for bandage changes. This careful treatment of enemy soldiers' minor wound contradicted everything we'd been taught about American disregard for enemy lives. The testimony documented that food provided during processing exceeded what Japanese army had provided even before supply shortages. According to the account, we received hot meal, canned meat, beans, bread, fruit, coffee with sugar. Portions were large. We were told to eat as much as we wanted. Some soldiers couldn't eat full portions because their stomachs had shrunk from months of inadequate rations. Americans didn't force us to eat everything, but encouraged us to eat until satisfied. The abundance was shocking. Americans fed prisoners better than Japanese army fed its own soldiers. Most significantly, the testimony described Americans explaining prisoner rights according to archives. Yamamoto stated, interpreter translated American officer's explanation of Geneva Convention. Officer said we had rights as prisoners of war, right to adequate food, medical care, shelter, and humane treatment. He said we would not be tortured or forced to provide military information beyond name, rank, and unit. He said letters would be permitted to families once mail system was established. He explained these rights as if they were obvious rather than generous. Americans seemed to believe prisoners deserved humane treatment as matter of basic decency rather than special mercy. August 20th, 1945. Yamamoto's testimony included detailed account of first encountering ice cream, frozen dessert he'd never experienced before, that became symbol in his memory of American abundance and casual generosity. According to the testimony, POW Camp Mess Hall served ice cream for dessert approximately 5 days after processing. The testimony stated, after evening meal, American soldiers began distributing small containers of frozen dessert they called ice cream. I had never seen anything like it. It was extremely cold and sweet. Flavor was vanilla, though I didn't know this word at the time. I ate it slowly because temperature hurt my teeth. Taste was unlike anything I'd experienced. It seemed impossibly luxurious. Frozen dessert served to prisoners in middle of tropical island where refrigeration itself seemed like miracle. The testimony documented Yamamoto's psychological reaction to ice cream service according to archives. He stated, I remember thinking, these Americans give ice cream to prisoners, not just adequate food, but luxury dessert. While Japanese soldiers on home islands were starving, American prisoners of war were served frozen treats. The contrast was overwhelming. I realized Japanese propaganda about American moral bankruptcy was false. Nation that served ice cream to captured enemies possessed abundance and generosity we hadn't understood. I began questioning everything I'd been taught about Americans. The testimony noted that ice cream service wasn't special treat, but regular occurrence according to archives. Yamamoto stated, ice cream appeared regularly, perhaps once or twice weekly. Americans treated it as normal, but to us it represented incomprehensible abundance. Americans had industrial capacity to manufacture, refrigerate, and distribute frozen desserts to prisoners on remote Pacific Island. This demonstrated resource superiority that explained American victory more than any battlefield analysis could. They hadn't defeated us through superior courage or tactics. They'd buried us under industrial production that made ice cream for prisoners while we couldn't provide basic rations for soldiers. September 1945. Yamamoto's testimony described Americans providing baseball equipment and encouraging Japanese prisoners to form teams, introducing sport most had never played, while demonstrating American approach to prisoner rehabilitation through recreation. According to the testimony, American guards delivered baseball equipment to POW compound in early September. The testimony stated, guards brought bats, balls, gloves, and explained baseball rules through interpreters. Many prisoners had heard of baseball. It was played in Japan before war, but most of us had never played. Americans encouraged us to form teams and practice. They said physical exercise was important for maintaining health and morale. They treated baseball as normal recreational activity rather than privilege for prisoners. The testimony documented that Japanese prisoners initially responded with confusion, according to archives. Yamamoto stated, "We didn't understand why Americans wanted us playing games. In Japanese military, prisoners were meant to suffer. Recreation for enemies seemed wrong. Some prisoners thought it was trick. Perhaps Americans were identifying leaders through observing who organized teams. But Americans seemed genuinely interested in us playing baseball for its own sake. Guards watched our practice sessions and offered coaching advice. They cheered when we made good plays." Their enthusiasm seemed authentic rather than manipulative. Most significantly, the testimony described baseball becoming vehicle for interaction between prisoners and guards, according to archives. Yamamoto stated, "Guards began playing catch with prisoners during off-duty hours. Language barriers prevented conversation, but baseball provided shared activity. We learned to communicate through sport, gestures about proper throwing technique, demonstrations of batting stance, shared laughter when someone made mistake. Baseball created moments where we were just men playing game rather than conqueror and conquered. These moments humanized Americans in ways that undermined propaganda about their barbarity." October 1945. Meanwhile, at Supreme Commander Allied Powers headquarters in Tokyo, psychological warfare officers were analyzing reports from POW camps and designing policies to maximize demonstration of American values through prisoner treatment. Psychological Warfare Section, report dated October 15, 1945, preserved at National Archives, documented strategic thinking behind POW treatment policies. The report stated that treatment of Japanese prisoners represented opportunity to demonstrate American character through actions rather than propaganda. According to the report, Japanese soldiers have been taught that Americans are barbarians who torture prisoners and disrespect enemy dead. Our treatment of prisoners provides opportunity to disprove this propaganda through direct experience. Every meal, every medical treatment, every respectful interaction contradicts Japanese military teaching and creates cognitive dissonance that undermines militarist ideology. The report outlined specific policies according to archives. POW diet would match or exceed Japanese civilian rations, demonstrating American abundance. Medical care would follow same standards as American military personnel, demonstrating American valuation of human life. Recreation would be encouraged, demonstrating American belief in prisoner rehabilitation rather than punishment. Geneva Convention protections would be explained and enforced, demonstrating American commitment to international law. Most significantly, the report stated strategic objective according to archives. Our goal is transforming Japanese prisoners into witnesses who will testify about American character based on personal experience. When these men return to Japan, they will tell families and communities about their treatment. Their testimony will be more persuasive than any propaganda because it comes from personal experience rather than government messaging. We are creating ambassadors for democracy through humane treatment of defeated enemies. November 1945. Yamamoto's testimony described being permitted to write letters to family in Japan, communication that provided first indication to Japanese civilians about American treatment of prisoners. According to the testimony, POW camp administration announced in early November that prisoners could write letters to families. The testimony stated, "We were given paper and envelopes. We could write whatever we wanted with only restriction that we couldn't include military information. Letters would be reviewed by censors, but primarily to ensure no security information was disclosed rather than to control our description of treatment. I wrote to my parents telling them I was alive and that Americans were treating prisoners well. I described food, medical care and recreational activities. I wanted them to know I was safe and being treated humanely." The testimony documented that Japanese families receiving letters were shocked by descriptions of treatment according to archives. Yamamoto stated, "My parents later told me they didn't believe my first letter. They thought Americans had forced me to write lies about good treatment to deceive Japanese people. But subsequent letters repeated same information. Other families received similar letters from prisoners in American custody. Eventually, pattern became clear. Americans really were treating prisoners humanely. This revelation contradicted years of propaganda about American barbarity. The testimony noted that letters from American custody contrasted sharply with conditions Japanese civilians faced according to archives. Yamamoto stated, "While I was eating adequate food in POW camp, my family in Japan was starving. American firebombing and naval blockade had devastated Japanese food production and distribution. My parents survived on perhaps 200 calories daily, while I received 3,000 calories in POW camp. This reversal was difficult to process. I was prisoner of enemy but better fed than free Japanese civilians. The contrast demonstrated how completely Americans dominated and how generously they treated defeated enemies despite having power to starve us as we had starved them." December 1945. Yamamoto's testimony described Americans celebrating Christmas in POW camp and including Japanese prisoners in festivities, cultural sharing that demonstrated American religious tolerance and generosity toward enemies. According to the testimony, American guards decorated POW compound for Christmas in December 1945. The testimony stated, guards hung decorations, set up Christmas tree, and explained Christmas traditions through interpreters. They told us Christmas was religious celebration, but also cultural holiday emphasizing family and generosity. They invited us to attend Christmas service in Camp Chapel, not to convert us, but to share their holiday traditions. Many prisoners attended out of curiosity about American customs. The testimony documented that Christmas meal for prisoners exceeded even normal abundant rations according to archives. Yamamoto stated, Christmas dinner included turkey, multiple side dishes, bread, desserts, and special treats. Portions were enormous. Americans treated us to feast that surpassed anything I'd eaten even before war. After meal, American chaplain explained that Christmas emphasized peace and goodwill toward all people. He said Americans believed defeated enemies deserved compassion rather than vengeance. Some prisoners wept hearing this message because it contrasted so completely with Japanese military values emphasizing vengeance and harsh treatment of defeated enemies. Most significantly, the testimony described receiving Christmas gifts from American civilians according to archives. Yamamoto stated, American Red Cross distributed packages containing toiletries, writing materials, candy, and small gifts. Packages included notes from American families wishing us well, despite knowing we had fought against their country. These gifts from enemy civilians were incomprehensible. Americans whose sons had died fighting Japanese sent gifts to Japanese prisoners. This generosity toward enemies demonstrated American character in ways that transformed our understanding of them. We realized Americans didn't hate us personally despite fighting brutal war. They separated soldier from person in ways Japanese culture hadn't taught us to do. January 1946. Yamamoto's testimony described encountering Japanese-American soldiers serving as guards and interpreters, meeting that forced confronting complexity of loyalty and identity in ways that challenged assumptions about ethnic identity determining allegiance. According to the testimony, Yamamoto first spoke with Japanese-American soldier in January 1946 during routine camp interaction. The testimony stated, "Guard who spoke perfect Japanese approached me during recreation period. His appearance was Japanese but uniform was American. He introduced himself as Sergeant James Tanaka from Hawaii. He explained he was American citizen of Japanese ancestry who had served in 442nd Regimental Combat Team, most decorated unit in American military history. I was confused how Japanese person could fight for America against Japan. He explained that being ethnically Japanese didn't mean he couldn't be loyal American." The testimony documented conversation that challenged Yamamoto's understanding of national identity, according to archives. He stated, "Sergeant Tanaka told me his family had lived in Hawaii for 2 generations. He considered himself American who happened to have Japanese ancestry rather than Japanese person living in America. He said he fought for America because he believed American democratic values were worth defending even though America discriminated against Japanese Americans through internment camps. He said he criticized America while serving it, something impossible in Japanese military culture that permitted no criticism of authority. This complexity was difficult to understand but compelling. Most significantly, the testimony described Tanaka explaining why he guarded Japanese POWs humanely, according to archives. Yamamoto stated, "I asked Sergeant Tanaka how he could treat Japanese prisoners well when we had killed his American comrades. He said Japanese prisoners weren't responsible for Japanese military's decisions. He said we were soldiers following orders, not personally evil people. He said American values required treating prisoners humanely, regardless of what their military had done. This distinction between soldier and person, between following orders and personal morality, was sophisticated in ways Japanese culture hadn't taught us to think. Americans could hate what we'd done, while treating us as human beings deserving basic dignity. This capacity for moral complexity impressed me deeply." March 1946. Yamamoto's testimony described repatriation process beginning in early 1946 as American authorities began returning Japanese prisoners to homeland, return that would transform prisoners into witnesses testifying about American character based on direct experience. According to the testimony, POW camp administration announced in March 1946 that repatriation would begin soon. The testimony stated, "Americans explained we would be returned to Japan on ships scheduled over coming months. Process would be orderly. We would be fed well during voyage. We would be given some supplies to take home including food, clothing, and small amounts of money. Americans seemed concerned we would have adequate resources to restart civilian lives in devastated Japan." Their concern for defeated enemies' welfare seemed genuine rather than strategic. The testimony documented that final days in American custody included formal education sessions according to archives. Yamamoto stated, "American officers conducted classes explaining democracy, free markets, and individual rights. They described American political system and encouraged us to support democratic reforms in Japan. Some prisoners were skeptical. They thought classes were propaganda attempting to make us betray Japan. But Americans weren't asking us to betray Japan. They were explaining how democracy could benefit Japan. They said Japan could become prosperous, peaceful democracy while maintaining Japanese cultural identity. They believed defeat could ultimately benefit us if we learned from victors. This seemed arrogant, but also oddly generous. They wanted their defeated enemies to prosper rather than suffer. Most significantly, the testimony described final words from American camp commander, according to archives. Yamamoto stated, "Commander addressed us before departure, saying he hoped we would remember American treatment and testify truthfully about what we experienced. He said Americans had tried to treat us humanely, not because we deserved special mercy, but because humane treatment reflected American values. He said he hoped our experience would help us understand Americans weren't barbarians Japanese propaganda had described. He wished us well in rebuilding our lives in Japan." His words seemed genuine. I believed he truly hoped we would prosper, despite having been his enemies. April 1946. Yamamoto's testimony described returning to devastated Japan and sharing testimony about American POW treatment with family and community, testimony that would influence Japanese public opinion about Americans and occupation. According to the testimony, Yamamoto arrived at Yokohama in April 1946. The testimony stated, "Japan was unrecognizable, cities were destroyed, people were starving. American occupation forces controlled everything. I expected occupation to be harsh based on how Japanese military had treated occupied populations, but Americans occupying Japan showed same restraint I'd experienced in POW camp. They provided food to starving civilians. They allowed Japanese government to function. They treated Japanese with respect, despite having power to exact vengeance." The testimony documented Yamamoto's testimony to family and neighbors about POW experience according to archives. He stated, "I told my parents Americans had treated prisoners humanely. I described food, medical care, recreation, even ice cream. My parents initially didn't believe me. They thought I'd been brainwashed or was lying to please occupation authorities. But other returning prisoners told similar stories. Pattern became undeniable. Americans really had treated prisoners well despite 3 years of brutal combat. This revelation forced many Japanese to reconsider what they'd been taught about American barbarism. Most significantly, the testimony described how POW testimony influenced Japanese attitudes toward occupation according to archives. Yamamoto stated, "Because I'd experienced American treatment directly, I could testify about American character from personal knowledge rather than propaganda. When occupation policies seemed generous, I told neighbors this matched what I'd experienced in POW camp. When Japanese complained about occupation restrictions, I reminded them Americans could have been far harsher given what Japan had done. My testimony and testimony from thousands of other former prisoners helped convince Japanese population to accept occupation and democratic reforms. We were witnesses whose credibility came from having been their prisoners." 1985. Guam. Yamamoto's published memoir from 1985 titled From Enemy to Friend, My Journey from Japanese Soldier to American Ally described returning to Guam 40 years after surrendering, return that brought full circle his transformation from expecting torture to experiencing kindness. The memoir stated, according to published text, that Yamamoto visited Guam as tourist in 1985. The memoir described, "I wanted to see island where I'd surrendered and where Americans had first shown me unexpected kindness. Island had changed completely. American military installations had been expanded, tourist infrastructure built, but I could still find approximate location where I'd been processed as prisoner 40 years earlier." The memoir documented chance encounter with former American POW guard, according to published account. Yamamoto stated, "While visiting War Memorial, I met elderly American man who mentioned he'd served as guard at POW camp in 1945. I told him I'd been prisoner there. We compared dates and realized he might have been my guard. We couldn't confirm this definitively, neither remembered specific faces from 40 years earlier, but possibility created connection. We shared lunch discussing our experiences from opposite perspectives. Most significantly, the memoir described conversation that addressed transformation, their encounter represented according to published account. Yamamoto stated, "I told him that American treatment in POW camp had transformed my understanding of Americans and influenced my support for post-war alliance. He said he'd been nervous guarding Japanese prisoners in 1945 because propaganda had taught him Japanese were cruel, fanatical enemies. But interacting with us daily had shown him we were ordinary soldiers following orders rather than monsters. He said, humanizing each other through daily interactions had been important for both sides. We agreed our country's alliance had been built partly on foundation of former enemies learning to see each other as human beings rather than propaganda caricatures." Post-war analysis comparing American treatment of Japanese POWs with Japanese treatment of American POWs revealed stark disparity that shaped post-war narratives and Japanese national self-reflection. Statistical analysis documented mortality rates according to military records. American POWs in Japanese custody experienced approximately 27% mortality rate, roughly 27,000 deaths among 100,000 captured, according to Department of Defense records. Causes included starvation, disease, torture, execution, and medical neglect. Japanese POWs in American custody experienced approximately 3 to 4% mortality rate, roughly 1,000 deaths among 25,000 captured, according to Defense Department records. Most deaths resulted from combat wounds sustained before capture rather than mistreatment during captivity. Dietary analysis showed American POWs received approximately 600 to 900 calories daily in Japanese camps, according to survivor testimony, far below minimum for survival. Many American POWs weighed under 100 pounds at liberation. Japanese POWs received approximately 2,500 to 3,000 calories daily in American camps, according to Red Cross inspections, adequate for maintaining health. Most Japanese POWs gained weight during captivity. Medical treatment comparison revealed American POWs received minimal medical care in Japanese camps. Wounds went untreated. Diseases spread unchecked. Medications were withheld. Japanese POWs received medical care matching American military standards. Wounds were treated. Diseases were controlled. Medications were provided freely. International Red Cross inspection reports documented that Japanese refused Red Cross access to POW camps until 1945, and even then restricted inspections. Americans permitted Red Cross inspections throughout war and corrected deficiencies inspectors identified. This contrast, according to historical analysis, created moral disparity that shaped post-war narratives. Americans could claim moral high ground based on documented humane treatment of prisoners. Japanese faced uncomfortable truths about systematic abuse their military had inflicted on prisoners. This disparity influenced post-war Japanese self-reflection about militarism's moral costs and contributed to Japanese willingness to embrace democratic reforms, emphasizing human rights and international law. Post-war analysis by American occupation authorities assessed whether humane treatment of Japanese POWs had achieved strategic objectives of creating witnesses who testified about American character. Civil Information and Education Section report dated December 1948, preserved at National Archives, evaluated POW reintegration into Japanese society and their influence on public opinion. The report stated that approximately 23,000 Japanese POWs had been repatriated by end of 1946. According to the report, surveys indicated that 89% of former POWs reported favorable or very favorable impressions of American character based on their POW experience. The report noted, former POWs consistently describe adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment. Their testimony contradicts Japanese wartime propaganda about American barbarity. This testimony has been influential in shaping Japanese public attitudes toward occupation and democratic reforms. The report documented that former POWs were more supportive of occupation policies than Japanese civilians who hadn't experienced American custody, according to surveys. The report stated, POWs who experienced American treatment directly are significantly more likely to support democratization, view Americans favorably, and advocate cooperation with occupation authorities. Their testimony based on direct experience carries more weight than government propaganda. They serve as credible witnesses to American character in ways that advance occupation objectives. Most significantly, the report assessed return on investment of humane treatment according to archives. The report stated, cost of treating 23,000 Japanese POWs humanely, adequate food, medical care, recreational facilities, was approximately $50 million over 2 years. This investment created 23,000 witnesses who testify about American character based on direct experience. Their influence on Japanese public opinion has been substantial. From a strategic perspective, humane POW treatment was highly cost-effective investment in post-war Japanese-American relations. Comparison with punitive treatment alternatives suggests humane approach produced far superior strategic outcomes for minimal additional cost. Japanese POW experience in American custody revealed fundamental truths about how victors treat defeated enemies, about cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality, and about foundation for transforming enmity into alliance. First truth, how victors treat defeated enemies determines whether defeat produces lasting resentment or foundation for future cooperation. American choice to treat Japanese POWs humanely despite brutal combat created witnesses who testified about American character from direct experience. This testimony influenced Japanese public opinion more effectively than any propaganda could, because it came from former enemies rather than conquerors. Humane treatment transformed defeated soldiers into ambassadors for democracy. Second truth, cognitive dissonance between propaganda and experienced reality undermines ideological indoctrination. Japanese soldiers were taught Americans would torture captured enemies. Experiencing humane treatment contradicted this propaganda, creating cognitive dissonance that forced re-evaluating everything they'd been taught. Accumulated evidence, adequate food, medical care, ice cream, baseball equipment, respectful treatment, systematically demolished propaganda through direct contradiction. Reality proved more persuasive than propaganda. Third truth, demonstrating values through actions proves more effective than proclaiming them through words. Americans didn't tell Japanese prisoners that democracy valued human dignity. They showed it by treating prisoners humanely. They didn't claim American abundance. They demonstrated it by serving ice cream to prisoners. They didn't argue American values were superior. They proved it by contrasting American POW treatment with Japanese POW treatment. Actions spoke louder than propaganda. Fourth truth, treating enemies as human beings rather than propaganda caricatures enables reconciliation after conflict. American guards who interacted with Japanese prisoners daily came to see them as ordinary soldiers rather than fanatical monsters. Japanese prisoners who experienced American humanity came to see guards as decent people rather than barbarians. Baseball games, medical treatments, and daily interactions humanized each side to the other, creating foundation for post-war alliance that propaganda alone couldn't have built. Fifth truth, generous treatment of defeated enemies from position of strength demonstrates confidence and moral authority that harsh treatment cannot achieve. America possessed power to exact vengeance on Japanese prisoners, but chose humane treatment instead. This restraint demonstrated strength and moral confidence that impressed Japanese more than cruelty would have. Showing mercy when vengeance was possible proved American values were genuine rather than situational. Hiroshi Yamamoto's journey from expecting torture to receiving ice cream represented broader transformation of Japanese understanding about American character and post-war possibilities. What began as cognitive dissonance, "Why aren't they torturing us?" evolved into recognition that American values weren't propaganda, but genuine commitments that extended even to defeated enemies. The ice cream he received as prisoner became symbol in his memory of American abundance and generosity that contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had taught. The baseball gloves represented different symbol: American belief in rehabilitation rather than punishment, in maintaining dignity even in captivity, in shared humanity transcending enmity. Playing baseball with American guards created moments where former enemies became just men sharing recreational activity. These moments proved more transformative than any propaganda about democracy could achieve, because they demonstrated democratic values through lived experience. The contrast with Japanese treatment of American POWs created moral disparity that shaped post-war narratives and forced Japanese national self-reflection. Americans could claim moral high ground backed by documented evidence of humane treatment. Japanese faced uncomfortable truths about their military's systematic abuse of prisoners. This disparity didn't produce lasting resentment because Americans used their moral advantage generously, not to humiliate Japan, but to encourage democratic reforms emphasizing human rights. Americans had demonstrated through POW treatment. 40 years after surrendering, when Hiroshi Yamamoto returned to Guam as tourist and met former American guard, their friendly conversation represented complete transformation of relationship between former enemies. The conversation was possible because Americans had chosen humane treatment over vengeance in 1945. That choice created foundation for transforming bitter enemies into close allies within single generation. Japanese soldiers expected torture based on propaganda, teaching them Americans were barbarians. Instead, they were given ice cream and baseball gloves and medical care and respectful treatment. This contradiction between expected torture and experienced kindness proved more powerful than any propaganda campaign could achieve. It demonstrated American character through actions rather than words. It created witnesses who testified about American generosity from direct experience, and it established foundation for post-war alliance that transformed defeated enemy into close friend. The mathematics of that transformation were written in ice cream servings and baseball games and medical treatments, and thousands of small kindnesses extended to defeated enemies. These small kindnesses accumulated into strategic victory that shaped post-war Asia. American choice to treat Japanese POWs humanely was conscious strategic decision backed by psychological warfare analysis about creating witnesses to American character. That strategy succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, creating 23,000 ambassadors for democracy who testified about American values based on personal experience rather than propaganda. When Hiroshi Yamamoto told his grandchildren 40 years later about receiving ice cream as prisoner, he was teaching them lesson about how Americans treated defeated enemies with unexpected generosity. That lesson shaped their generation's understanding of America and supported alliance that has lasted 8 decades. The ice cream and baseball gloves given to Japanese prisoners in 1945 proved to be investments that yielded returns measured in generations of cooperation between former enemies who learned through direct experience that the best way to win peace is treating defeated enemies with humanity that demonstrates your values are genuine rather than propaganda.